Hey guys, welcome. Before we dive into the story today, let me first turn to you, the ones listening, watching, and joining me across the world. Tell me, where are you tuning in from right now? What city, what country, what place do you call home? And what time is it for you as you sit here, leaning in to listen? Because wherever you are, whatever hour of the day it is, I invite you to set aside the noise of the modern world and step back with me into one of the most awe-inspiring, yet most misunderstood chapters of human history. Together, we are going to peel back the gold leaf and stone carvings. We are going to set aside the romantic myths of power and splendor, and instead, we are going to uncover the hidden burdens, the crushing responsibilities, and the often miserable realities of what it truly meant to be a pharaoh of ancient Egypt. This is not the story of eternal glory. This is the story of why it really sucked to be a pharaoh. When we think of a pharaoh, our minds conjure images of towering pyramids, lavish tombs, golden death masks, and colossal statues gazing serenely across desert sands. We imagine a king who was a god in human form, a ruler whose word was law, whose riches were endless, whose reign was secure. And yes, the pharaoh was worshipped as a living deity, his power absolute in theory, his presence immortalized in stone and legend. But behind that shining mask of divine authority lay a far harsher truth. To be pharaoh was to carry the weight of a civilization on one's shoulders, to never know true freedom, to live surrounded by enemies and rivals, to constantly perform the impossible task of holding together a fragile world where drought, plague, or rebellion could undo centuries of labor. The life of a pharaoh was not a dream of luxury, but a test of endurance. And most often, it was a test one could never win. From the moment a prince was born into the royal palace, his fate was sealed. He was not born to be a child in the ordinary sense, to play freely, to grow without burden. He was born already claimed by the gods, already a symbol of cosmic order known as Ma'at. Every word he would speak, every gesture he would make, every decision that would shape his days, these were not his own, but the acts of the God King on earth. Imagine, for just a moment, being told from birth that you are both mortal and divine, that you carry within your flesh the destiny of millions, and that any weakness, any failure, any hesitation could bring ruin not only upon yourself, but upon the entire world. That is where the story begins, not in power, but in suffocating expectation. Education for a future pharaoh was relentless. From his earliest years, he was taught to read hieroglyphs, to understand complex rituals, to memorize myths and laws, to grasp the subtle balance between religion and politics. He was trained in military skills, strategy, and combat, because one day he would be expected to lead armies. He was surrounded by tutors, priests, and officials, each drilling into him not only knowledge, but the performance of authority. Even as a child, he was never truly alone. Privacy did not exist for a pharaoh, because his life was considered too important, too sacred, to risk even a moment of vulnerability. Where another boy might have found joy in the small pleasures of youth, the future pharaoh was already rehearsing the weight of a crown. And when the day came to ascend the throne, the burden only grew heavier. The coronation of a pharaoh was a dazzling spectacle. Trumpets, processions, hymns, offerings to the gods. It was theater on the grandest scale. But beneath the ceremony lay a chilling truth. From that moment onward, the pharaoh was no longer simply a man. He was Horus incarnate, the falcon god on earth, the son of Ra, the guarantor of Ma'at. He was expected to rule with perfection, because imperfection was not permitted to a divine king, and yet he remained painfully human. He could fall ill. He could grieve. He could doubt. But none of these were acceptable for a pharaoh. His humanity was a weakness he was never allowed to show. One of the greatest burdens was the concept of Ma'at itself. Ma'at was not simply justice or order. It was the very principle that held the universe together. The rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the soil, the peace of the kingdom, all were believed to hinge upon the pharaoh's ability to maintain Ma'at. If crops failed, it was because the pharaoh had faltered. If enemies invaded, it was because the pharaoh had lost divine favor. If plague struck, it was his failure to protect his people. The weight of every disaster, every hardship, was laid at his feet. Can you imagine living under the crushing belief that the balance of the cosmos rested upon your shoulders? That is what it meant to be pharaoh. Nor was the pharaoh free to trust those closest to him. The royal court was a nest of intrigue and ambition. High officials, priests, generals, and even members of the royal family schemed for influence. To be pharaoh was to live surrounded by flatterers, spies, and potential traitors. Poison in the cup, daggers in the dark, whispers of conspiracy, these were not distant fears, but constant realities. The throne of Egypt was one of the most coveted seats in the ancient world. And rivals, both foreign and domestic, were willing to spill blood to seize it. Even one's own sons might conspire, eager to accelerate their inheritance. And thus the pharaoh lived in a palace that was as much a gilded cage as it was a seat of power. Then there was war. It began, as it always did, with whispers. Whispers that the Nile itself was no longer enough. Whispers that the gods demanded more than offerings of grain and incense. Whispers that power must be seized, tested, proven in blood. The pharaoh, seated on his gilded throne, was not merely a king of men. He was Horus incarnate, falcon-eyed and eternal, chosen to bind chaos with the weight of his will. Yet even gods on earth could not silence the hunger of men. Egypt was a kingdom forged between two lands, the black soil of the Nile, heavy with life, and the red desert, vast and unyielding. For centuries, unity had been fragile, like papyrus reeds bent beneath the flood. And so, when war came, it was never just a clash of armies. It was the question of Egypt itself. Would upper and lower remain bound beneath the crown of one divine ruler? Or would the land fracture, devouring itself like a serpent that forgets its own tail? The pharaoh stood at the center of this eternal struggle. Draped in linen, crowned with the double headdress, his very body became a battlefield. To his subjects, he was the son of Ra, morning sun reborn in flesh. To his enemies, he was a shadow, his armies endless, like the waters that rose each year from the river. To himself, he was a prisoner, for kingship was no throne of gold, but a burden of granite. Every decision, every victory, every failure etched itself into eternity on temple walls and tombs carved deep into stone. The first wars were not wars of empire. They were wars of survival. Tribes rose like storms, seeking to claim what the river gave. The pharaoh's soldiers, barefoot yet unyielding, marched with spears of bronze and shields painted with the eye of Horus. They were farmers in flood season, warriors in drought, their calloused hands wielding weapons as they once wielded plows. At dawn, they prayed to Amun for strength. At dusk, they prayed again for mercy. Blood stained the sand, and from that blood rose a truth. Egypt could not endure divided. Unity was carved not with ink, but with the sword. And so, the pharaoh became both builder and destroyer, builder of walls and cities, destroyer of those who dared defy the two lands. Temples rose as fast as bodies fell. The gods, ever hungry, demanded monuments in return for victory. Karnak swelled with columns that touched the heavens. Luxor glowed with torches that lit the night, and beneath the shimmer of gold, slaves and laborers strained, their sweat soaking into limestone. They were told their work was sacred, that each block raised toward the sky was a stairway for the king's soul, an anchor for eternity. But the cracks in their hands told another story. The pharaoh was immortal in name, but mortal in flesh. His enemies did not wait for death to claim him, they hastened it. Treachery slithered through palaces like the cobra, silent and sudden. Brothers turned on brothers. Queens plotted for their sons. Priests whispered of omens in the stars, and generals dreamed of crowns. To be pharaoh was to sleep beside daggers, and yet, with each generation, the crown endured. Ramses, Amenhotep, Thutmose, names carved in fire, remembered in stone. Some sought glory in conquest, pushing Egypt's shadow into Nubia, into Canaan, into lands where the desert gave way to strange tongues and strange gods. Others sought eternity through worship, closing their ears to the clash of spears, listening only for the voice of a moon in the wind. But war always returned, for Egypt's wealth was too bright a flame to go unnoticed. Gold poured from her mines, grain overflowed from her granaries, and ships heavy with treasure drifted across the Mediterranean. Neighbors watched, jealous. Enemies gathered, patient. Each pharaoh learned the same lesson. Peace was an illusion. Behind every treaty was a sharpened blade. The people bore the cost. In fields along the Nile, widows reaped alone. In villages, children wore amulets of faience and whispered prayers for fathers who would never return. Scribes inked the names of the dead on papyrus scrolls, neat lines of grief carried into eternity. Priests promised that in the afterlife, all wounds would heal, all families reunite. But still, the wailing echoed through the villages when messengers arrived. The pharaoh could not weep with them. His tears were forbidden, hidden deep within the sanctum of his chambers. For to cry was to doubt the gods. To doubt was to show weakness. And weakness in Egypt was not merely punished, it was erased. Dynasties rose and fell. One king claimed to be chosen of Ra, and temples bent to his will. Another was forgotten, his name chipped away from stone, his face hacked from statues, as though he had never breathed. Time itself was a war. One pharaoh against the next, each carving his legacy before the desert swallowed his name. But the war that mattered most was not fought on battlefields. It was fought in the heart of Egypt's eternal paradox. The pharaoh was divine, yet doomed. Worshipped as a god, yet destined for decay. And so he built tombs larger than mountains, pyramids that pierced the heavens, chambers sealed with curses to keep death itself at bay. Within those tombs, treasures gleamed, gold masks, alabaster jars, jewels that caught the fire of Ra. The pharaoh prepared for eternity with more care than he ruled in life. Still, eternity betrayed him. Thieves came, not gods. Shadows with torches slipped into chambers meant never to be opened. They shattered seals, broke sarcophagi, stripped bodies of gold. Pharaohs who had once commanded nations now lay scattered as dust, their bones thrown aside like refuse. The gods were silent. Eternity was not safe. And yet Egypt endured. For though kings died, Egypt lived. The Nile rose and fell as steady as breath. Flood, seed, harvest, drought, the eternal rhythm that fed the land. Farmers bent their backs, builders raised their stones, priests chanted their hymns, and scribes inked their records. Life continued beneath the shadow of kings. The people did not live for pharaohs. Pharaohs lived because of the people. But the monuments told another story. Then came kings who sought more than conquest or worship. They sought to rewrite the very soul of Egypt. One closed the temples, silenced the priests, and raised a new god, Aten, the sun disk itself. He called himself Akhenaten, and in his reign, Egypt's eternal balance shattered. The gods were abandoned. The people turned restless. And though he built a city for his new faith, carved hymns to his radiant god, the moment he died, the old gods returned. His statues were toppled, his name cursed, his memory damned. Eternity proved cruel. The tale of the pharaohs is not one of triumph without end. It is a tale of fragility. Kingdoms fractured, foreign invaders marched, and once mighty thrones trembled. But the image of the pharaoh, divine, radiant, eternal, endured. Even when Greeks ruled, even when Romans came, the crown of Egypt still glittered in their dreams. Cleopatra, last of the line, fought not just Rome, but time itself, trying to hold the illusion of divine kingship against the tide of history. When she fell, so too did the age of pharaohs, yet their shadows remain. In temples where columns still rise like stone forests, in pyramids that defy the desert, monuments to both human ambition and human folly, in tombs where painted walls whisper stories of kings and queens who sought eternity and found only silence. This was the legacy of war. This was the burden of divinity. This was Egypt. Egypt thought itself untouchable. After all, the deserts were walls of fire, the Nile was a lifeline, and the pyramids stood like eternal fortresses. But then came the Hyksos, foreign kings from the north, riding into Egypt with something the pharaohs had never seen before, the horse-drawn chariot. Egyptian armies, still fighting on foot with bronze spears, were cut down like stalks of grain. Pharaohs who once claimed divinity suddenly hid behind crumbling walls. Imagine the humiliation. A god forced to bow to foreign rulers. For a century, Egypt lived under the Hyksos. Pharaohs became shadows, pretending to hold power while outsiders ruled their cities. To the people, the god kings had failed. The divine image cracked. When the Egyptians finally fought back, reclaiming their land with blood and fire, their pharaohs returned as warriors. But victory only chained them further, because from that moment on, a pharaoh was expected to fight forever. Look at Thutmose III, called the Napoleon of Egypt. He led over 17 campaigns into foreign lands, stretching Egyptian control as far as Syria. His empire glittered with plunder, tribute, and slaves. But for Thutmose, the battlefield was endless. He spent more of his life marching than ruling. His palace was a war camp, his throne a saddle, his divine voice drowned by the screams of dying men. And every victory only made the burden worse, because empires are hungry. The moment you stop feeding them, they collapse. For the pharaoh, it was simple: conquer or be conquered. And yet, war was only half the curse, because back home, another enemy grew stronger, not with swords, but with prayers. The priesthood of Amun, guardians of Egypt's gods, slowly became more powerful than the pharaohs themselves. They owned temples larger than cities, controlled land, wealth, and the hearts of the people. Every pharaoh was forced into a deadly balancing act: bow to the priests or risk divine rebellion. Even Akhenaten, the heretic king, tried to break free. He abandoned the old gods, built a new religion around Aten, the sun disk, and even founded a new capital. For a moment, he thought he had freed himself from the priestly grip. But after his death, his statues were smashed, his name erased, his city abandoned to the sand. The priests won. His dream vanished like dust. Being pharaoh wasn't divine freedom. It was divine servitude. And then there were the betrayals. Because when you live as a god, every friend is a servant, and every servant is a spy. The harem, filled with wives and concubines, was a palace of daggers. Queen mothers schemed to place their sons on the throne. Court officials whispered of rebellion. Even guards could be bought. Consider the harem conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramses III, one of the greatest kings of the New Kingdom. He built temples, fought off invasions, restored Egypt's glory. But inside his palace, his own wife plotted his murder. Poison, magic spells, assassins in the dark, all woven into a conspiracy that nearly tore Egypt apart. The trial records still survive, listing dozens of conspirators, judges, priests, royal servants, even his own family. And Ramses, he died not as a god, but as a man betrayed by his closest circle. Imagine the paranoia, sitting on a golden throne, knowing that every smile might hide a blade. And still, pharaohs carried one final burden: immortality. Every pharaoh was obsessed with the afterlife. Their entire reign was a countdown to death, a race to build a tomb that could cheat eternity. But eternity was a cruel joke. Grave robbers looted pyramids within decades of a pharaoh's burial. Priests secretly stripped mummies of gold to pay debts. Even the Valley of the Kings, carved into stone and hidden in cliffs, was no sanctuary. Take Tutankhamun, a boy king who died young, buried in haste. His tomb escaped discovery only because it was small, unremarkable, and buried under rubble. Every greater pharaoh's tomb, robbed, defiled, or destroyed. The irony is brutal. Pharaohs spent their lives enslaved to death, building monuments to eternity, and eternity erased them anyway. By the end, Egypt's god-kings were no longer divine. Assyrians stormed their cities. Persians enslaved their people. Even Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. And the priests, those same priests who had once crowned pharaohs, crowned him instead. The last pharaohs, like Cleopatra, ruled not as gods, but as desperate politicians in a crumbling world. She clung to power with charm, with seduction, with alliances to foreign generals. And still, Egypt fell. The god-kings had become pawns. So yes, pharaohs lived in palaces of gold, commanded armies, built wonders of the world. But behind the mask of divinity was a prison of war, paranoia, betrayal, and death. To be a pharaoh was not to be free. It was to be trapped. A god in name, a slave in truth. By the time the first millennium BCE rolled across Egypt like a slow-moving sandstorm, the golden age of pharaohs had long faded. The empire had grown fat on conquest, wealth, and divine delusion. But wealth breeds envy, conquest breeds resentment, and divinity, absolute divinity, breeds isolation. Pharaohs were now hollow gods. Palaces remained magnificent. Temples glittered in the desert sun. But the people whispered. Cities decayed. Armies faltered. Priests plotted. And pharaohs, still swaddled in the illusion of divine power, were powerless to stop it. Dynasties collapsed like sandcastles under the rising tide. Sons murdered fathers. Generals murdered kings. And succession was less a matter of right than a matter of survival. Take the 21st dynasty, a period of fractured authority, where pharaohs barely controlled Lower Egypt, while high priests of Amun in Thebes ruled Upper Egypt like independent monarchs. The irony is suffocating. The god-king, meant to embody order, stability, and cosmic balance, was reduced to a ceremonial figurehead, while priests, governors, and military commanders wielded real power. Imagine your life, every sunrise supposedly bowing to your will, and realizing that the real decisions, the real actions, were made by someone else entirely. This is the beginning of the pharaoh's greatest torment: irrelevance under the guise of omnipotence. Then came the Greeks. Alexander the Great, a mortal with ambition and an army, strode into Egypt. He was crowned pharaoh, not because he was divine, but because the Egyptians needed a king who could defend them. a god in uniform rather than in spirit. The old gods were silent. Temples still stood, but the priests were careful. They bowed to survive. The pharaoh, once the unquestioned deity on earth, became a diplomatic title, a concession to political reality rather than cosmic will. When the Ptolemies ruled, Egypt's pharaohs were Greek by blood, language, and culture. They wore the masks of divinity, but the ceremonies were hollow. Court intrigues, foreign alliances, and assassination plots replaced the sacred burdens of the past. They were still pharaohs, yes, but pharaohhood was no longer a bridge between heaven and earth. It was a gilded cage of optics, diplomacy, and theater. Then there was Cleopatra, the seventh, the last pharaoh of Egypt, perhaps the most famous, certainly the most human. She inherited not only a kingdom in political and economic decline, but also the legacy of every pharaoh who came before her. Imagine bearing the weight of centuries of divine expectation while balancing alliances with Rome's most ruthless generals, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and knowing your death would end the line of pharaohs forever. Her divinity was both her shield and her shackle. She had to perform godhood in the presence of mortals who knew better. She had to maintain Egypt's sovereignty while navigating a world where divine power was meaningless against Roman legions. And yet, she persisted. Not because she was immortal, but because she understood that being a pharaoh was never about freedom. It was about survival, performance, and legacy. By now, the pattern is clear. To be pharaoh was to live a life of contradictions. You were omnipotent, yet fragile, revered, yet envied, immortal in spirit, but mortal in flesh. Your every action carried cosmic and political consequences, yet the universe was indifferent to your suffering. You couldn't relax. You couldn't make mistakes. Even your thoughts were monitored by priests, scribes, and spies. Your sleep was never peaceful. Your body was never your own. And the expectation of divine perfection to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order itself, was not a suggestion. It was law. Imagine this, for centuries, the pressure of performing godhood in a collapsing kingdom, surrounded by enemies in every corner, while knowing that failure would be blamed not on circumstance, but on your inadequacy as a divine being. That is the reality pharaohs lived. Every pharaoh, from Menes to Cleopatra, faced the same unrelenting tension between mortal vulnerability and divine expectation. And so, the pharaoh turned to tombs, temples, monuments. Pyramids and statues were not just for the gods or the people. They were for the pharaoh's own sanity. If the living could not honor you properly, perhaps the dead could. Yet even this obsession with legacy could not shield the pharaoh from ultimate failure. Tombs were looted, cities destroyed, inscriptions erased. The grandeur of a lifetime of performance could vanish in a generation, leaving behind only dust and legend. Being immortal in myth did not protect you from mortality in reality. So why did it suck to be an Egyptian pharaoh? Let's tally the burdens. Total surveillance. Every glance, every word, every sneeze had cosmic implications. Privacy was an illusion. Political paranoia. Friends were potential assassins. Family members were rivals. Servants were spies. Allies were only temporary conveniences. Religious oppression. The priests controlled divine legitimacy, wealth, and politics. Defy them, and your reign or your life was at risk. Constant war. Empire demanded conquest. Peace was temporary. The battlefield was always looming. Marriage and heirs. Dynastic marriages, often incestuous, with the weight of the nation on reproductive success. Physical and ceremonial torment. Crowns, gold, headdresses, and 30-pound robes. Style came before comfort, health, or sanity. Psychological strain. eternal expectations of perfection. Every mistake blamed on divine inadequacy. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and isolation were standard. Mortality and legacy. Death came for all pharaohs. Tombs were looted. Dynasties fell. Divine authority ended in dust. In short, pharaohhood was an endless performance, a gilded prison, a psychological crucible. It looked glorious from the outside, but inside, every pharaoh lived under the weight of a world that both worshipped and feared him, trusted and envied him, and ultimately would outlast him anyway. Being a god on earth was not freedom. It was eternal responsibility, relentless expectation, and unending paranoia. And that, dear viewer, is why it truly sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh. The pyramids still rise from the desert, silent witnesses to the impossible lives of pharaohs. The temples still echo with chants that are thousands of years old. Statues still gaze toward the Nile, eternally stoic. But behind each stone, behind each relief, behind each gilded mask lies the truth. The pharaoh was never truly a god. He was a man, shackled by divinity, hunted by mortality, and burdened by the impossible weight of expectation. And perhaps, in that unbearable tension between omnipotence and helplessness, we can finally understand the most human truth of all. Power is never as freeing as it seems. For the pharaohs of Egypt, it was not pyramids, temples, or armies that defined their lives. It was suffering, responsibility, and the cruel theater of eternity. And in the end, that is the story of why it sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh.